Welcome to History in 6, a place where we sample history in small increments. I'm your host, T. Melendel, and today in our journey through the American Revolutionary War, we're going to look at the Battle of Oriskany. Time is short, let's jump into it. In 1777, London conceived a bold plan to crush the rebellion by isolating New England, who they perceived as the heart of the Patriot cause. The plan envisioned a three-pronged pincer movement converging on Albany, New York, seizing control of the vital Hudson River Valley. General John Burgoyne would lead the main army south from Canada down Lake Champlain. General William Howe was expected, well at least by Burgoyne, to drive north from New York City up the Hudson. And then the third prong, a crucial supporting expedition, was assigned to Lieutenant Colonel Barry Sillinger. His mission was to advance east from Lake Ontario, moving down the Mohawk Valley and proceeding to Albany to link up with Burgoyne and Howe. The Mohawk Valley itself was a rich heartland of New York, a vital artery for trade and travel. It was home to a complex tapestry of peoples. There were prosperous colonial farms dotting the landscape. It was the ancestral homeland of the powerful Haudenosaunee, the Six Nations Iroquois Confederacy of Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, Seneca, and Tuscarora. For generations, tensions had festered here. Old prejudices, bitter land disputes, struggles for political power and commerce. The American Revolution did not ignite these fires, but it fanned them into a brutal inferno. Here the war for independence became a vicious civil war, pitting neighbor against neighbor, brother against brother, and tragically, nation against nation within the Iroquois Confederacy itself. The stage was set in Fort Stanwix, which was recently repaired and garrisoned by American troops under Colonel Peter Gansevoort, stood as the focal point. For it guarded the Oneida carrying place, which was an important portage linking the Atlantic with the interior of the country. So in July of 1777, Sillinger's forces found themselves besieging Fort Stanwix. Word of the siege reached Brigadier General Nicholas Herkimer via his Oneida allies. On July 30th, Herkimer issued a call to arms for the Tryon County militia. By August 4th, roughly 800 militiamen had answered the summons. They assembled at Fort Dayton, where they were joined by a contingent of up to 100 Oneida allies. The combined force began its march westward along the Mohawk River Valley Road, aiming to break the siege. By the evening of August 5th, Herkimer's column made camp near the small Oneida village of Oriskany. They were now only 6 to 8 miles east of the besieged Fort Stanwix. Herkimer dispatched 3 messengers to slip through the enemy lines and reach Colonel Gansevoort with his plans for attack. His plan involved the militia halting their advance until they heard 3 cannon shots from Fort Stanwix. This signal would indicate that Gansevoort was launching an attack upon the British. Upon hearing the signal, Herkimer's militia would then attack the British from their position, effectively trapping the enemy between the militia and the fort's sortie in a hammer and anvil maneuver. However, the messengers faced difficulty penetrating the siege lines and were delayed in reaching Gansevoort. As the morning of August 6th wore on, impatience grew among Herkimer's subordinate officers. Waiting near the enemy with no signal forthcoming, they began to challenge Herkimer's leadership. Tempers flared. Herkimer was accused of cowardice, harboring Loyalist sympathies, a particularly stinging charge as his own brother, Johann Jost Herkimer, was indeed serving with Sillinger's forces. Herkimer, known for his normally cautious nature, was deeply affected by these accusations. His pride was wounded, his temper ignited, forcing him to make a fateful decision. Against his better judgment and abandoning his original plan, he angrily ordered the militia column to advance immediately without waiting for the signal from the fort. Unbeknownst to Herkimer, his movements were already known to the enemy. Sillinger had been alerted to the militia's approach on August 5th through intelligence provided by Mohawk scouts. This timely intelligence allowed the British to react swiftly. Sillinger immediately dispatched a strong detachment specifically to intercept and ambush the American relief column before it could reach the fort. The British commanders selected their ambush site with care. They chose a deep, swampy ravine located about 6 miles east of Fort Stanwix and just west of Oriskany Creek. Here, the rough military road descended steeply, crossing a marshy bottom, and then climbed the opposite slope. The terrain was ideal for concealment. Sir John Johnson positioned his Loyalist Royal Yorkers behind a rise at the western end of the ravine to block the head of the American column. John Butler's Rangers and hundreds of Mohawk, Seneca, Cayuga, and Onondaga warriors under Brant concealed themselves in the thick woods lining both sides of the ravine. Brant's Mohawks were assigned to strike the rear of the column once they were fully inside the trap. The ambush was perfectly prepared. The only thing left was to await the unsuspecting militia. Around 10 o'clock on the humid morning of August 6th, the vanguard of the Tryon County militia marched right into the waiting jaws of the trap. Critically, Herkimer had neglected to deploy scouts or flankers, a basic precaution anyone would make when potentially moving through hostile territory. The long column, with General Herkimer riding near the front and the slow-moving supply wagons trailing behind, descended into the gloomy ravine. The British plan called for Johnson's Loyalists to engage the head of the column first, bottling up the Americans before the indigenous warriors swept in from the flanks and the rear, encircling the Americans. However, the plan went awry. Before the entire militia column had entered the ravine, the concealed warriors could no longer restrain themselves. A signal was given and a devastating volley erupted from the trees. The surprise was absolute. The effect was catastrophic. The militia, caught completely unaware in the constricted terrain, were thrown into instant chaos. Colonel Ebenezer Cox, commanding the 1st Regiment at the head of the column, was shot from his horse and killed in the first hail of bullets. General Herkimer's horse was struck and killed, collapsing, trapping the general beneath it. A musket ball shattered Herkimer's lower left leg. At the rear of the column, the men of the 3rd Regiment under Colonel Visker, many of whom had not yet entered the ravine, were struck with panic. They fled eastward, away from the carnage. Indian warriors pursued the fleeing militiamen, cutting them down along the road for miles. In these first chaotic minutes, roughly half of Herkimer's forces were killed, wounded, or scattered in flight. But that still left hundreds of militiamen trapped within the ravine. The battle instantly became a desperate, swirling melee. It was not a battle of orderly lines and volleys, but a brutal, close-quarters struggle for survival. Tomahawks, knives, bayonets, clubbed muskets became primary weapons of these combatants. The fighting was intensely personal, fueled by pre-existing hatreds of the Mohawk Valley Civil War. Former neighbors finding themselves locked in mortal combat. Brother fought against brother in this bloody confines of the ravine. Amidst the terrifying chaos and carnage of the initial ambush, the leadership of Brigadier General Herkimer proved decisive. Though suffering from a grievous wound, his legs shattered below the knee, he refused officers' pleas to retire to the rear. Instead, he directed his men to carry him to the base of a large beech tree on the slight rise west on the ravine floor. Calmly lighting his pipe, Herkimer began to direct the defense, becoming a visible symbol of resolve in the face of disaster. Inspired by their commander's extraordinary courage and fighting for their very lives, the trapped militiamen and their Oneida allies began to regain some semblance of order. They fought their way out of the marshy bottom of the ravine, consolidating their position on the higher ground to the west. Here they managed to form a rough defensive perimeter, sheltering behind trees and rocks. For the next hour, this desperate band of militia and Oneida warriors held off the furious attacks of the Loyalists and their Iroquois allies. Around 11 o'clock that morning, nature intervened. The humid, oppressive air broke into a violent summer thunderstorm, which swept over the battlefield. Torrential rain lashed down, soaking the combatants and rendering their flintlock muskets temporarily useless as powder pans became wet. The intense downpour forced an unwilling pause in the fighting, which lasted about an hour. General Herkimer used this unexpected respite wisely, observing the effectiveness of the Iroquois tactic of rushing individual militiamen with tomahawks while they were struggling with the slow reloading process. So he ordered a tactical shift. During the lull, he instructed his men to reorganize and fight in pairs. One man would fire while his partner was reloading. This simple but effective tactic aimed to ensure that one weapon was always loaded, significantly reducing their vulnerability to close quarters attacks during the reloading cycle. Meanwhile, the British forces also used the break. Sir John Johnson, concerned by the unexpected tenacity of the trapped militia, rode back to Sillinger's main camp near Fort Stanwix to request reinforcements, returning with 70 additional men from his Royal Yorkers. John Butler, commander of the Rangers, interrogated some of the captured militiamen during the storm and learned of Herkimer's plan to wait for a 3-cannon signal from the fort. Seizing on this, Butler devised a ruse. He persuaded the newly arrived Royal Yorkers to turn their green uniform coats inside out in an attempt to make them resemble American troops arriving as a relief party from the direction of Fort Stanwix. As the storm subsided and the rain lessened, the fighting resumed. The disguised Loyalists advanced towards the American perimeter. The deception nearly succeeded, but it was the intimate nature of this civil conflict which proved its undoing. Patriot Captain Jacob Gardiner peered closely at the approaching troops and suddenly recognized the face of one of those Loyalist neighbors among them. Shouting a warning, Gardiner and his men opened fire. The ruse collapsed. The brutal close-range fighting erupted once more. While the desperate struggle raged on in the Oriskany ravine, events were unfolding back at Fort Stanwix that would have a direct impact on this battle. Herkimer's messengers, after their perilous journey through enemy lines, finally reached the fort about the time the storms broke out, delivering news of the militia's approach. Peter Gansvoort immediately acted on Herkimer's request for a diversionary attack. He ordered his second-in-command, Lieutenant Colonel Marinus Willett, to lead a sortie against the besiegers' camps. As the thunderstorms began to clear, Willett mustered 250 men along with a small light 3-pounder cannon. Charging out of the fort's main gate, Willett's force headed toward the main Loyalist and Indian encampments located south and east of the fort, near the Mohawk River landings. Willett specifically targeted these camps based on prior scouting reports from Oneida allies operating outside the fort. With most of the warriors and Loyalists engaged miles away in Oriskany, the camps were nearly deserted. The few remaining guards were quickly overwhelmed or fled towards the main British camp further north. Willett's men then proceeded to thoroughly loot and destroy the enemy encampments. They gathered a significant amount of spoils, destroying what they couldn't carry. Critically, they seized Sir John Johnson's personal baggage, which contained letters with campaign plans. Several prisoners were also captured. As Willett prepared to return, Sillinger hastily assembled troops from the main British camp in an attempt to cut off the American raiding party. However, Willett effectively used his 3-pounder cannon, along with the covering fire from the fort's artillery, to disrupt the British formation and deter the attack. Willett and his men marched back into Fort Stanwix triumphant, having executed the raid without the loss of a single man. The sortie was a stunning success. It provided a significant morale boost to the besieged garrison, who also now possessed valuable intelligence gleaned from the captured documents and prisoners regarding the enemy's strength and intentions. More importantly, the raid had a direct impact on the battle still raging miles away at Oriskany. Willett's attack on the camps eventually reached the ears of the combatants at Oriskany, relayed by frantic messengers. For the Mohawk, Seneca, Cayuga, and Onondaga warriors who were fighting alongside the Loyalists, the news that their camps, which contained their provisions, spare clothing, personal belongings, and family members, were being raided was quite alarming to them. Already discouraged by the unexpectedly fierce resistance of the militia and mounting casualties among their own ranks, their enthusiasm for the fight evaporated. Protecting their possessions and families became their immediate priority, so they began to disengage from the battle and stream back towards the besieged fort. With the abrupt departure of their crucial Indian allies, the remaining Loyalist and British forces under Sir John Johnson and John Butler found their position untenable. They too were forced to break off the engagement and withdraw from the battlefield. The Battle of Oriskany, after roughly 6 hours of savage fighting, sputtered to an end. On the American side, the surviving Tryon County militia were exhausted, traumatized, and severely depleted. They had held their ground against overwhelming odds after the initial shock, but they were really in no condition to press on towards Fort Stanwix. Their objective of relieving the fort was a failure. Their focus instead shifted to survival and evacuating the wounded. They gathered as many injured comrades as they could, including their gravely wounded commander, General Herkimer, and began the sorrowful retreat eastward back towards the relative safety of Fort Dayton. The American casualties that day were horrendous. Of the 800 militia and 100 Indians, 385 were killed, 50 wounded, 30 captured and missing. Almost half of the militiamen who marched with Herkimer were killed in the battle, an almost unparalleled fatality rate for an American force during the Revolutionary War. The stark ratio of killed to wounded illustrated the brutal nature of the close quarters fighting and lack of mercy shown. And this impact on Tryon County was immense. Nearly every community felt the loss. The Tryon County Militia Brigade was effectively shattered as a fighting force for the remainder of the war. The British themselves were not immune to casualties. The British regulars who tried to stop Willett had 7 killed, 21 wounded. The Loyalists who fought in the battle had a handful of casualties. The Indians supporting the British cause had up to 150 casualties. For the Iroquois people, it marked a horrific moment as their centuries-old Confederacy turned upon itself, forever remembered in their oral traditions as a place of great sadness. The heavy losses inflicted on Sillinger's indigenous allies, coupled with the psychological blow of Willett's raid, severely damaged the cohesion and morale of the besieging forces. But still, the siege continued. If you've enjoyed this video, hit the like button, subscribe to get future content, and as always, have a great day if you want to.